Well, again, good morning, and thanks for being here with us. We never want to take that for granted that God gathers His people together week in and week out, and what a privilege it is to be able to be in His presence. And as John said earlier, if you're new, we want to welcome you, especially ask that you'd stick around afterwards and let us have the opportunity to get to know you over what we think is actually the best church coffee in the world. I think it probably is. So. When I was learning how to drive, one of the things that I had a bad habit of doing was that I would oftentimes stare too much at the dashboard, or I'd just look at the road right in front of the car, and I would have a tendency to kind of veer either over onto the shoulder or sometimes across the center stripe or whatever. And my dad always, when we would drive, he would always tell me, dude, you got to lift up your head. You got to look up a little further down the road. Pay attention to the cars that are a little bit further, and believe it or not, you'll actually be able to keep this thing in the right lane. And as a matter of fact, Derek, he would also say, you also need to make sure you're checking your mirrors every once in a while. There are cars behind you. You need to make sure that you're checking your blind spot and that you're looking at your side mirrors and stuff like that. And in a way, I almost feel like we need the same kind of encouragement when it comes to our jobs. Because it's tempting, and rightly so, for us to be so fixed upon the next task that we have to do. We have to have our focus on that next call or that next customer or the next sermon or whatever it is that we're doing. We have to be focused, and we have to do those things excellently. That's what it means to actually have a job, to have work. You have to do those things with focus and with intentionality. But the problem is that a lot of times we don't lift up our eyes and see the bigger picture. We don't look in the mirror and see what actually is behind us and the ways that God has been faithful. We don't look around us at the things that other people are doing, realizing that it's actually because of their service that we actually benefit in life as well. And so that, in essence, is kind of the message for today. That you have to keep your eyes on the story even while you keep your hands on the plow. That's the thing that we have to see, that we have to learn. Over these last few weeks, what we've been talking about as we've entered into this series of work is that when you really do understand the big picture and that it's God who has invited us into these jobs that we have, we realize that jobs become vocations. They really are callings. They're things that God, the caller, has invited us into, whatever they are. No matter how big, no matter how seemingly small, these things are important because they're callings from God. And work, in and of itself, I want you to think about work this way. Work is an opportunity to steward God's good creation. It's an opportunity to bless other people through the things that you do, and it's an opportunity for you in every way to point to this one who has called you into that work. It's an opportunity to steward, to bless, to point. But the only way that we're going to have that framework in our jobs, whatever we do, is if we remember the big picture. You can't get so focused on what's right in front of you that you never lift up your eyes and see the rest of what's going on around you. And there's actually a quote from Cotton Mather, who was actually a pastor in this area way back in the day, back in the 1600s, where he says, God hath made man and woman societal creatures, and we expect benefits from human society. It is but equal then that human society should receive benefits from us. We are beneficial to human society by the works of that special occupation in which we are to be employed according to the order of God. Now, is that the perspective that you have about work? That because we're social creatures made in God's image, that not only do we experience the blessings of the work that other people do, but other people are to experience the blessings of the work that we do, whatever it is. Is that the picture that you have? That's what I want us to actually see today. And I know it's hard sometimes because we do get so focused on our jobs and on the task at hand that we don't lift up our eyes. But there's a painting that I actually came across a number of years ago that I think reflects this idea. It's a painting by Jean-Francois Millet. If you're not French, maybe you'd say Jean-Francois Millet. But this painting is called The Angelus. And in the foreground, it's kind of hard to see because of the shadows, but in the foreground, these two farmers are actually praying over the potato harvest. And you can see that they're bowed down in prayer, and then in the background is a church. And for me, this painting captures the reality of needing to be focused on the task at hand, and yet at the same time, see the big picture. And in so many ways today, that's what I want you to capture. That's my prayer, that we would keep our eyes on the story and our hands on the plow. Tim Keller once wrote this. He said that people cannot make sense of anything without attaching it to a storyline. It's true. You can't make sense of anything that you do, including your work, unless you attach it to some kind of story. Let me give you another example outside the realm of work for just a second. Stephen Covey gives this as a parable in one of his books. He says, imagine that you're actually on a subway, and as you're riding into your job, there's a man with his 3 kids there on the same train as you, and the 3 kids are just all over the place. They're not paying any attention. They're interrupting the passengers. Many of you are kind of like, yeah, I've had that experience every day that I ride the train into work. But as this other passenger is standing there observing everything that's going on with this father and these 3 kids, this other passenger starts putting together a story of what's going on. This guy's a bad father. He doesn't pay attention to his kids. Look at what happens when you don't do this. And maybe part of that is because of that passenger's story. Maybe he had a really hard time, really hard upbringing with his family. And so he's reflecting on that. And so finally the passenger gets so upset with this father who's not paying attention to his kids that he says, hey, you need to control your kids. Get them under control. And the father looks up as if he was in a daze and he says, sorry. Their mom just passed away a few days ago, and the kids are just dealing with the reality of that. We can't make sense of anything that we experience in life unless we attach it to a story. And if we don't get the story right, then our response to everything in life is going to be wrong. So in that situation, you see that this passenger weaves together a story. This is a bad father, and he gets the story wrong, and so his response to this father and to these 3 kids is wrong. But what if we get the story of the world wrong? Well, then your response and your job is going to be a wrong response because you're framing that story in a wrong way. And so today, we need to get our picture or our eyes clear on the picture of this story that God is weaving. If life is just about self-fulfillment, if that's all this life is, if that's the story of the world, if it's that and not the love of God and blessing others and stewarding God's creation, then we're going to strive for selfish gain. If life is nothing more than us trying to wrestle whatever meaning we can from our work, if we have to create it for ourselves, then we're going to end up responding wrongly. And I think we're all going to end up at some point, like we talked about a few weeks ago, having the perspective of the writer of Ecclesiastes, when we work under the sun, and as we try to scratch out meaning apart from God, it just all becomes vanity of vanities. So we have to get the story right, and that's where we have to start today, is that we need to remember constantly. We need to remember the story of God constantly. Today we're going to be looking at Colossians chapter 1 and chapter 3, and let me give you just a little bit of background on this city. It's a Roman colony, a Gentile city, and the thought that prevailed in Colossae in that day was that the spiritual was supreme and that the physical was bad. You can imagine what that does for a person's perspective on work. But the other part of that is that there were these warring cosmic powers that were in this tug of war that no one was ever going to win. And when the Jews finally came to Colossae with their story about God, they gave them hope. But the Jewish story was that you have to do certain things. You have to eat certain ways. You have to be circumcised and obey certain laws and regulations. And so the Colossians started embracing that until the gospel came. Through one of Paul's associates, a man by the name of Epaphras, who shared the gospel there. And Paul writes Colossians to, in essence, restory the Colossians. He wants to remind them of the gospel. He wants to put the big picture on the big screen so that they can remember constantly the bigger story. And I don't know of any text actually in all of Scripture that is bigger than these 5 verses in Colossians chapter 1. Starting in verse 15. The text says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. And he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross." That is a sweeping, all-encompassing story. 5 verses. It's a worldview. That's what it is. It's seeing everything that we experience in one sense, all at one time, summed up under the lordship of Jesus Christ. The idea of a worldview, if you were to look it up or find a definition of it, you'd see it described as a comprehensive perspective from which we interpret all of reality. It's a master narrative or a master story. Peter Kreft, actually a professor down in the city, I can't remember if he's at BU or BC offhand, but he says, or he describes a worldview where he says, think about a worldview like going to visit your doctor. It's this comprehensive narrative, but you could also think of it in terms of a medical analysis. And if you were to do a medical analysis of the world, you would need a prognosis. You'd want to describe what the world should be like. But then, you'd also want to describe the world's symptoms, what it is like and what's wrong with it. And then you'd want to give a diagnosis. What are the cause of the symptoms? What's the underlying issue that we are seeing, or that maybe we don't see, but that creates all of these symptoms, all of the brokenness, all of the fallenness? And then what's the prescription? How do we actually restore health back to the world? Well, in Colossians 1, Paul has given a medical analysis, so to speak. He's diagnosed what's going on. He says that the prognosis, what ought to be, is reconciliation and restoration of relationship and the goodness of God's creation. The symptoms, though, are death and the fracturing of relationships. Anytime you use the language of reconciliation, you're talking about brokenness in relationship. And Paul points that out, even if implicitly in this text. What are the symptoms in Colossians? Well, death and the brokenness of relationships. And what's the diagnosis? What's the underlying cause? Sin and rebellion. If you read in context of Colossians 1:15-20, Paul talks all about that and our desperate need for forgiveness. And what's the prescription? Well, Paul says, God makes peace by the blood of Jesus' cross. But Jesus is also the firstborn from the dead. We are desperate for resurrection. I don't know how much more sweeping a worldview you can give than that. But that is the biblical story. And we need to remember constantly the story, even in our work. And this is a song. It's a hymn. Verses 15-20 is a hymn that most people actually think was being sung by the church at this time. Now, why would Paul write it this way? Why would they put this idea in a hymn? So that you'd remember it. So that you could retain it. It's easier to remember songs and lyrics than it is narratives sometimes. But what does any of this have to do with your work? Everything. Everything. Because if you get the story of the world wrong, you're going to get your response in your work wrong. I'll give you an example. Look at what Keller says in his book, Every Good Endeavor. He writes, our worldview places our work in the context of a history and a cause, a quest, and a set of protagonists and antagonists. And in so doing, it frames the strategy of our work at a high level. At a day-to-day level, our worldview will shape our individual interactions and decisions. The Christian worldview locates the problem with the world not in any part of the world or in any particular group of people, but in sin itself, our loss of relationship to God. And it locates the solution in God's grace, our restoration of relationship with God through the work of Christ. He continues and he says, without an understanding of the gospel, we will either be naively utopian, I think I can bring about goodness and wholeness in life, or cynically disillusioned. This is all meaningless and pointless. We will be demonizing something that isn't bad enough to explain the mess that we're in, and we'll be idolizing something that isn't powerful enough to get us out of it. This is, in the end, what all other worldviews do. So question, what is the worldview that you take to work every single day? What's the story? What's the big picture? Is it that life is meaningless? That you have to scratch out whatever meaning you can through whatever job you have? Is the worldview or the story that you go to work with that work is evil? That it ever and always has been and will be? Is it that money and profit is the answer? Is it the fact that it's all up to you to make or to sustain or to accomplish something that will last? Is it the idea of I'm going to have to save this company, this project, this whatever it is? Is it that your boss or your competitors are the enemy and that they need to be vanquished and that you and your fellow employees are somehow going to vanquish them? Is that the worldview that you have when you enter into work? Because again, when you remember the biblical story, when we just pause and we consider these 5 verses that we read in Colossians 1, He is the image of the invisible God. And He's the Lord. He's the one that rules over all things. Only He will vanquish all of the foes. And your foe is not your boss. It's not even your competitor. It's sin. And sin is at work within you as well. And you need just as much reconciliation as they do. Verses 16 and 17, Paul says that Jesus created and is sustaining all things. It's not up to you. It's not only up to you. God, in his providence, has put you in that place, in the stations of life, as Martin Luther would say. He's given you that position, and he's even put your boss in position over you. Whoa. He's the head of the church. That's you. That's you. That's not this. It's not this location. You are the church. We are the church. And we're just as much the church when we're scattered in the marketplace as we are when we're gathered in this place. And Jesus is just as much our leader and our head when we are out there in the workplace as we are in here. So when your boss comes in and asks you to do something unethical, as we're going to see in a minute, you can't because you have a greater boss. He is the head. In Colossians 1, verses 9 through 14, Paul prays, and I love this. Think about it this way. Paul gives this worldview in verses 15 to 20, but then he attaches it to something as commonplace as prayer. And look at what Paul prays for. He says, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you, the Colossians, may be filled with the knowledge of God's will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you might walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, that you would be strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to God the Father, who is qualified to share in the inheritance of the saints of light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness, transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, that is, the forgiveness of sins. Paul connects this everyday thing of prayer to the big picture of who Jesus is. We've got to remember the story. Because if we get the story wrong, then our response day in and day out in our labor is wrong. And when you think about Colossians 1, 15 to 20, I want you to go home and look at it later today again. And I want you to pay attention particularly to verse 18, where Paul introduces the idea of the church. Because in the rest of the context of those verses, everything else is huge. It's the wide-angle lens that Paul is viewing all of life with. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Oh my goodness, and he's come to earth. And he's reconciling all things, whether things in heaven or on earth, visible and invisible. I want you to think of it almost like an hourglass, but right in verse 18, the throat of verse 18 is the church. Now, why would Paul put the zoom lens on the church in that instance? I think one reason, there are probably many, but one reason that Paul chooses to talk about the church in that huge context is that of any people in all of the face of the earth that should get this big picture, it should be us. And we should enter into everything that we do with this big picture in mind. We know God's story. We know God's intention for the world. So through our lives and through our work, we need to be seeing and creating and bringing beauty in the midst of ugliness. Through our work, we bring order in the midst of chaos. We bring integrity in the midst of brokenness. We bring reconciliation in the midst of fractured relationships. We bring hope in the midst of hopelessness. Presence where absence or abandonment would be easier. We bring forgiveness where bitterness and anger are constantly gnawing and tempting us. Because we see the big picture. We remember the story. And Paul moves from that in Colossians 1 to an incredibly practical place, and it's no wonder. Because these things are true about Jesus. These things are true about God's story. These things are true about God's world. And because of that, therefore, the gospel radically transforms everything we do, including our jobs. So Paul can move from that point, that big picture, lifting up our eyes and seeing the story, to now dropping and showing how our hands are on the plow. Look at Colossians 3:22-24, a passage that you've probably all heard before. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. Now here in Colossians 3, Paul's gone from the big picture down to the practical, the wide-angle lens to the zoom lens, the big picture of God's story for all of creation to now your daily labor. And those two things fit together beautifully. But don't be distracted by the language of slavery here. So many times we come to this and we get distracted with this language of slavery. Slaves, bondservants, obey your masters. Listen, this is not, nor is any other part of the Bible, an endorsement for the institution of slavery. And anyone who uses the scripture in that regard is dead wrong, period. God's heart from the beginning of time has been to set slaves free and to make them sons and daughters. Just look at the book of Exodus. But don't be distracted by that from seeing what God wants us to teach or wants us to learn, because we live in an inescapable reality of relationships that are made up of submission and authority. And in Colossians, God invites us to remember the story constantly, but to work at our vocations diligently. And that is simply what he says here. Paul says in Colossians 1, remember constantly the big story. Then he says here in Colossians 3, work your job diligently. These are God's invitations. But listen, as Paul begins to focus on how we should work here in this passage, you have to understand that none of what Paul says here makes any sense whatsoever without the big picture. Paul says, I want you to obey your masters in the flesh, or your earthly masters is the way the ESV translate it, but literally the masters in the flesh. Doesn't that imply that you have a master in the heavenlies? You don't just have a master, a boss on earth, but you have a master in the heavenlies. And it is him, Paul says, that you serve. As a matter of fact, 4 times here, Paul says, the Lord is the one that you're serving. Remember that sustainer, that one who holds all things together from chapter 1? That's your Lord, if you were wondering who it is. And he's the one that ultimately you serve. And Paul contrasts this idea twice. He says, you're not working for men. I don't want you to serve men, but serve the Lord, even in your job. He says, I don't want you to do this out of eye service or to be a people pleaser. When I had my first job at United Supermarkets in Lubbock, Texas, we had this kind of this inner agreement that as bag boys, because life was just so busy sometimes at the store, that what you would do is you would always have to walk fast and look busy. So that if the manager saw you, he wouldn't call you to actually do something else. So even if you were just goofing off, like we all would talk about this in the break room, the best thing to do is just walk fast and look busy. Oh yeah, that's good. Because if you look like you're on a mission for something, they're not going to ask you to do something. But that was eye service, right? I was just pretending. I was trying to people please in that situation. Is that the way you go about your job? Because Paul says no. The eyes of our master, our heavenly master, is always on us. He says, I want you to do this with sincerity, with singularity. That's the Greek word there of heart. What you see is what you get. Listen, our diligence in our work will be the accompanying expression to the confession of our faith. Our coworkers are going to be a lot more ready to listen to hear us say Jesus saves or Jesus is Lord if we're working like it. I love this quote or this prayer from Doug McKelvey in his book, Every Moment Holy. I actually printed this out a few weeks ago. But he says, praying, Jesus, be ever present as mediator between me and my employer, between me and my supervisors and coworkers, and in all my dealings with others in this work, reminding me that my treatment of them is the strongest evidence of my affection for you. I love that last line. Lord, remind me that my treatment of them is the strongest evidence of my affection for you. Paul says in verse 23, and I love this, whatever you do. It doesn't matter if you work in the financial district. It doesn't matter if you're a firefighter, if you're a pastor, if you're a homemaker, if you're a music teacher, if you're a builder. It doesn't matter what you do, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, for it is the Lord that you are serving. Can we get away from the idea of me being in full-time Christian ministry? Can we drop that? Because if I'm full-time, does that make you part-time? Like, are you a part-time Christian? I hope not. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. Because it's the Lord that you're serving. You're serving Him just as much as I am. And if I'm the one in full-time Christian ministry, then I guess you're part-timers. Or to say it differently, am I a professional Christian and you're amateurs? Right? That's not nice. Not only is it not nice, it's not true. So let's drop it. Whatever you do, that's God's story. That's God's perspective. Whatever you do, serve the Lord Christ. I love this quote from Lee Hardy in his book, The Fabric of This World. He says, the point of the Christian religion is not to leave the world behind to live the life of faith, but to live the life of faith in the midst of the world. The religious life is not the prerogative of a small group of spiritual specialists. Rather, it must be lived by all, and it can be lived in the context of everyday work. John Truschel sent this review of a book to me and a few others this week, and this sociologist that was reviewing the book actually had this little quote in it. He says, craftsmanship names an enduring basic human impulse. Whatever your craft is, craftsmanship names an enduring basic human impulse, the desire to do a job well for its own sake. Justin Martyr is one of the ancient fathers who lived actually in Galilee in the 2nd century. In one of his writings, he actually makes reference to the fact that the plows that Jesus and Joseph made were still in use in the 2nd century. How often do you think about the plows that Jesus made? He did his work well in all things because it was the Lord that he was serving. Is that the way that we think about our jobs? Now, one question that we all deal with, that we have to talk about, is the question of how do I know if I'm in the right vocation? Maybe you're in the middle of a job transition right now and you're wondering. I love this quote from Frederick Buechner. He says about vocation that the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Now, sometimes, as a caveat, you just have to get a job. But this is still very true. And let's wrap up this idea of working diligently with 4 quick things. If you are trying to discern if you're in the right vocation, start with trying to discern your personal gifts and your interests. There's a personal aspect to that, and there's a corporate aspect to that. What do you like to do? What are you good at doing? What do people affirm you in doing? That may be the place that God is calling you. So discern your personal gifts and your interests. Second, discern your concern for others. Don't just get a job because you can make a ton of money. Discern your concern for others. That is part of what God is inviting us to do, to bless the world with our gifts. So discern your concern for others. Third, take seriously God's providence. What opportunities are you allowed in the place that you're at right now? Remember, God's still over everything, holding all things together. So take seriously God's providence. And then finally, work for and in anticipation of God's complete redemption of all things. Whatever you do, work at it diligently, for it is the Lord that you are serving, the one who is going to recreate all things. Anticipate his full redemption in your job. Do it well, whatever it is. Remember the story and work diligently. Keep your eyes on the story while your hands are on the plow. In your bulletin this morning is a copy of this little poem by George Herbert. I came across it this last week as I was studying. I love the way that Herbert puts this together. Listen as I read. He says, "Teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to see, and in what I do in anything to do it as for thee. A man that looks on glass, on it may stay his eye, or if he pleaseth, through it pass, and then the heavens espy. All may of thee partake, nothing can be so mean, which with this tincture for thy sake will not grow bright and clean. A servant with this clause makes drudgery divine, who sweeps a room as for thy laws, makes that and the action fine. This is the famous stone that turneth all to gold. For that which God doth touch and own cannot for less be told." I think that Herbert would agree. Keep your eye on the story and your hands on the plow.